All right, let's just jump right in. We're going to talk about a name that, yeah, you absolutely know, Aristotle. But here's the thing. Knowing the name is one thing. Grasping the sheer mind-boggling scale of his impact, that's something else entirely. I mean, how do you even start to explain a guy who didn't just add to Western thought, but in a very real way, built the entire foundation it's standing on? You know, there's this quote that says to tell the story of Aristotle's ideas after he died is basically to tell the history of Europe. Just let that sink in for a second. We're talking about the man who created the very tools, the very categories of thinking that pretty much every philosopher, scientist, and politician would use for the next 2,000 years. It is almost impossible to exaggerate his importance. And this just says it all. For centuries, across completely different cultures, different religions, if you said the philosopher, everybody knew exactly who you were talking about. No last name needed. In Christian Europe, Thomas Aquinas just called him that. In the Islamic world, he was known as the first teacher. His authority was so total, he didn't need another name. So who was this person really? Let's do a quick flyby of his life. He's born way back in 384 BC in northern Greece. When he's about 17, he heads to Athens to study under the great Plato, and he stays there for 20 years. Then, in a plot twist you couldn't make up, he gets hired to tutor a teenager who would become Alexander the Great. After that, he goes back to Athens, founds his own school, the Lyceum, and that's where he produces most of his incredible work. What a life. But honestly, his life story is just the warm-up act. Aristotle's real legacy, the thing that changed everything, starts with this. He gave us the actual tools for how to think. He didn't just give us his opinions. He built a system for how anyone could arrive at a solid, rational conclusion. And the absolute heart of this system was his invention, the syllogism. The idea behind it is so simple, but it's also incredibly powerful. Just think of it like a little logic machine. You feed it two true statements, we call them premises, and it churns out a conclusion that has to be true. Before Aristotle, arguments were kind of a mess, right? A lot of emotion, a lot of fancy words. He gave us a formula for a valid, basically undeniable argument. And here it is, the classic example you always see. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Okay, yep, we can all agree on that. Premise 2, all Greeks are men. Also true. Well, if you accept those two things, then the conclusion, therefore, all Greeks are mortal, is inescapable. It's not an opinion anymore, it's a logical certainty. This is the very bedrock of rational thought, and he's the one who laid it all out for us. Okay, so the syllogism gives us a structure for our arguments. But Aristotle, being Aristotle, went even deeper. He asked, wait a minute, how do we even know what something is? How do we get a grip on reality itself before we even start arguing about it? And to answer that, he came up with the 4 causes, which is basically a recipe for understanding anything that exists. Let's use a simple table. The material cause is what it's made of, the wood. The formal cause is its shape, its design, the blueprint for tableness. The efficient cause is who or what actually made it, the carpenter. And then there's the big one, the final cause. Its purpose. What is it for? It's for holding dinner. This was a huge idea because it meant that everything has a purpose, an end goal, and you can't really understand what something is until you know what it's for. So what happens when you take these amazing logical tools and this new way of looking for purpose in everything, and you point them at the natural world? Well, you basically get the birth of science. Aristotle wasn't just some guy sitting in a room thinking. He was an obsessive observer. He took his framework and he applied it to nature, becoming what a lot of people call the very first true scientist. Now, his physics, it was a brilliant early attempt to make sense of the universe. He figured everything on Earth was made of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And the heavens were made of a 5th, divine element called ether. Look, we know now that this model's wrong, but you have to appreciate how groundbreaking it was. It was a complete, rational system to explain all of physical reality, and it was the go-to explanation for over 1,500 years. So here's the crucial part. While his physics was based more on logic and philosophy, when he turned to the living world, his method was completely different. He was a relentless, hands-on observer. He didn't just dream up theories about animals. He went out, he collected them, he cut them open, and he wrote down exactly what he saw. In doing so, he pretty much invented the entire science of biology. And the things he saw were just mind-blowing. He wrote accurate descriptions of the complex 4-chambered stomachs of cows. He figured out how some sharks grow from eggs inside the mother's body. Get this, he even identified a special arm on the male octopus used for mating, a discovery so far ahead of its time that other scientists didn't believe it was real until it was confirmed in the 19th century. 2,000 years later. The man's eye for detail was simply genius. So from logic to reality to the animal kingdom, Aristotle then turned that incredible systematic mind to the most important question there is. How are we supposed to live? Just like he looked for the purpose of a table, he wanted to find the ultimate purpose, the telos of a human life. And that ultimate purpose, he said, was something called eudaimonia. Now, we often translate that as happiness, but that's a little thin. It's not just a feeling. Eudaimonia is more like human flourishing. It's about living your best life, reaching your full potential. And you don't get there by accident. You get there through deliberate, virtuous actions that are guided by your reason. It's an activity, a whole way of living. Okay, so how do you act virtuously? This is where Aristotle gives us his famous big idea, the golden mean. He argued that every virtue is the perfect sweet spot, the balance point right in the middle of two vices, one where you don't have enough of the quality and one where you have way too much. Let's take courage, for example. Courage isn't just not being scared. It's the golden mean between the vice of cowardice, which is a deficiency of confidence, and the vice of rashness, which is an excess of it. Or generosity. That's the perfect sweet spot between being cheap on one side and being totally wasteful on the other. This was revolutionary because it turned ethics from a list of thou shouts and thou shalt nots into a practical skill. A good life meant constantly adjusting, trying to find that balanced, rational, virtuous middle path. So let's just try and pull all this together. A system for logic, a framework for understanding reality, the founding of biology, a practical guide to living a good life. It's honestly hard to believe it all came from one person. His legacy isn't just some historical curiosity. It is literally woven into the DNA of how we all think today. I mean, it's hard to even summarize what he did because you end up with a list like this. He's called the father of logic, the father of biology, of political science, zoology, embryology, rhetoric. The list just goes on and on. He didn't just dabble in these fields. In many cases, he drew the first maps and wrote the first rule books that everyone else would follow for hundreds and hundreds of years. And his influence wasn't just confined to Europe. It was truly global. After the Roman Empire fell, it was scholars in the Islamic world who preserved his works, studied them intensely, and built on his ideas. They were the ones who then reintroduced Aristotle to medieval Europe, where he became the absolute foundation for university education and theology. The man was a bridge between worlds. Just look at that number for a second. For more than 2,300 years, people have been arguing with, learning from, and building on top of the work that Aristotle did. Whether you agree with everything he said or not doesn't even matter. You are still living and thinking in a world that his mind helped build. And that kind of brings us full circle. His whole quest for the golden mean was a search for balance, right? For reason over pure emotion, for moderation instead of self-destructive extremes. So I'll just leave you with this to think about. In our world today, which is so often pulled to extremes, where could we really use Aristotle's wisdom of finding that virtuous, balanced middle ground?